Okay, so welcome to this very informal, very imperfect presentation on the force field analysis. My purpose for including this here is for those of you who are completing this course at a distance or who could not attend the weekend in which I actually introduced the force field analysis. Or maybe you're taking this course independently. So what is the force field analysis? The force field analysis is basically a model for thinking about change. It was originally put forward by German social psychologist Kurt Lewin, who actually immigrated to the US in 1932. So as you can imagine, this is not a particularly new model. It is a model from the 50s. And this is something that will be of interest to those of us in Iowa. Kurt Lewin actually taught at the University of Iowa. So in order to explain to you the force field analysis, I am going to use an example that I'm going to call the Workaholic. And that was an example that was based on my experiences when I moved from Wright State University to Drake University many years ago. Oops, went too fast. All right, so here was the situation. At that time, as I was finishing my work at Wright State University, my verdict was that I worked too many hours and had no work-life balance, and that I wanted to spend more time with my family, and I wanted to add some me time, some hobbies, some fun activities, etc. As I read this, I think it's kind of humorous because almost 10 years later, or more than 10 years later, I still work too many hours and have no work-life balance. But hey, I didn't say I was going to show you how I actually solved a problem. I told you that I was going to use an example to introduce the force field analysis. And actually, towards the end of the presentation, I'm going to show you what the problem is, why these things are never that neat. Okay, one of the things that the force field analysis does is it prevents you from trying to solve the problem right away by suggesting interventions. Leaders very often have a bias for action. As soon as they see a problem, they immediately want to solve it. And with the force field analysis, you gain a certain amount of discipline to just stop first and describe what you see, what's already there. And those two words, those three words, what's already there, are particularly key. Okay, so going back to my example, my desired outcome was to carve more time for myself, for health, for fitness, for hobbies, for learning how to quilt, whatever, and for my family. Identifying the desired outcome, where it is that you want to go, is one of the critical components of the force field analysis, and pretty much the first thing that you do. Next, you identify what we call the driving forces. The driving forces are existing situations, actions, decisions that are already in place and support the desired change. I'm going to emphasize here what you see bolded on the screen. They are existing situations that are already in place. You're not talking about potential solutions. Remember what I said before. One of the good things about the force field analysis is precisely to try to curb the bias for action that leaders have. So at this point, you're just looking at what's already in place and supports the desired change. So in the absence of anything that was against those so-called driving forces, those existing situations, actions, and decisions would probably make your desired outcome come to life. Let me give you a specific example here. So, what could be my driving forces, or the things that were already in place that by themselves would probably lead me to solve the problem? Okay, one of them was that I was absolutely exhausted. So one of the issues that was happening there is that I was driving too many hours. So that I had about an hour and a half distance to my job. So of course, 3 hours of commute to begin with. And that by itself was causing a lot of pain. So I was basically exhausted. And when you reach a level of exhaustion, that pushes you towards a resolution. The other driving force that I had was pressure from my family. So after a while, my family was getting kind of fed up that I wasn't spending any time with them. Of course, the issue is that there are not only driving forces, there are also what Lewin calls restraining forces. Restraining forces are existing decisions, actions, or situations that are already in place and work against the change. So again, we're talking about existing things. So always remember that word existing, because one of the tendencies that people have when they first try to use the force field analysis is they try to immediately come up with solutions, and that's precisely what you're trying not to do. So in my particular case, what were the restraining forces? So if you remember, the driving forces were my state of exhaustion and pressure from my family. What were, however, things that were keeping me from solving the problem, or keeping those two driving forces from actually pushing me towards solving the problem? Well, the first is my personality. Workaholism is in my DNA. It's a combination of perfectionism and a certain nervousness and fairly high, some aspects of resilience. No, actually, sorry. Certain aspects of conscientiousness or consolidation or focus are pretty high for me. So I have a high tendency normally to want to do things perfectly, to do too many of them, and I get nervous if they're not just how I planned. The second aspect that was preventing me from solving the problem was the long drive. So if you think about it, a 3-hour commute is going to make anybody's work harder, right? Or anybody's work-life balance harder. Okay, so my problem had then two forces. On the one side, I had driving forces supporting the change, and on the other side, I had restraining forces that blocked the change. And as you can see from the image, if those forces are approximately the same size or the same strength, then nothing happens. The problem doesn't move. That's what makes this model so simple and elegant. Okay, so what will happen if nothing is done? I am still tired, my family is still pressuring me, but those things are not counteracting the fact that I have a workaholic personality and that I'm driving 3 hours a day. So something has to change in that panorama in order to push the problem towards a resolution. And you may remember that my resolution was to have more me time and more time for my family. Okay, so now what? What can I do? So to break the equilibrium of driving and restraining forces, you must either strengthen the driving forces, make them stronger, or weaken the restraining forces, or do both at the same time. But often there are many forces. So in fact, I overly simplified this situation by giving you only two at a time. But actually, usually a problem has many different aspects, many different forces that are conspiring for or against the resolution. So which ones do you focus on? Because if you try to focus on too many forces at the same time, chances are you don't get anything done. So here is an easy chart that you may consider as you're trying to decide which forces to focus on. In this chart, you have two questions that you answer. The first one is how important is the force, from irrelevant to vitally important. So I don't know. Let's say that I decided that every day in the morning I take 15 minutes of snoozing. Okay, I don't know that 15 minutes of snoozing would particularly change my workaholism and exhaustion. So I could say that even though that could be a factor because I could spend 15 more minutes in the day doing something, that's probably irrelevant. It's not a very important force. Then the other question that you answer is how easy it is to change the force. So for example, if I came up with the answer that one of the problems or one of the factors in my situation is that professors usually, as a group, as a category, as a professional category, tend to work long hours. That's usually part of the deal. Professors are not 9-to-5ers. Well, even though that is a moderately important or vitally important force in this case, it's nearly impossible to change. At this point in my life, I'm not going to change my profession. So as you see, you identify a variety of forces that are conspiring for or against solving your problem, but you don't necessarily address all of them. So let's take a look here at my particular cases. Sorry, I went too fast here. And let's see if we can find the low-hanging fruit. The low-hanging fruit would be forces that are easy to change, either to strengthen or to weaken, and that are vitally important, or at least moderately important. It's no use working on things that are either nearly impossible to change or that are irrelevant. So in my case, I classified my personality and a personality that leads to exhaustion. I classified those as vitally important, but nearly impossible to change. In fact, I focused on two forces that I felt were either moderately easy or easy to change, respectively, the long drive, which was moderately easy. Of course, it required either moving to a new location or taking on a new job, but at least it was something possible to do. And pressure from the family was pretty easy because I could ask my family to ramp up the pressure. And I considered these things as moderately important or vitally important to my problem. As you can see, the long drive was a fairly low-hanging fruit because it was vitally important and moderately easy to change. Okay, so I selected those two to address. Now, you may remember that earlier in this presentation, I said, hey, I was going to show you an example of a case involving force field analysis, or that could potentially be diagnosed through the force field analysis. I never said that I actually managed to solve the problem. So here's the thing. Your changes may produce further changes in the system. So things are not so neat. For example, in my case, I solved the long drive by coming to Drake University, right? Well, the problem is that when I came to Drake University, I solved that problem. I no longer have a long drive, but I also added another problem, a tenure-track job with very stringent requirements for research, with a multitude of courses to prepare at the same time. And later on, the situation got even more complicated when I took over the program, the leadership of the program, and I had to basically do scholarly work, administrative work, research work, teaching, and everything at the same time. So even though what the problem with the force field analysis is that it's deceptively simple, it's great for you to start looking at the problem, but you always have to keep in mind the domino effect. When you change something in your system, something else is going to happen as a result of your changes. So nothing is that neat. With that said, the force field analysis can be an extremely useful model or system for you to conduct an initial diagnosis of your problem. And it's also a great way for you to involve your team in analyzing a problem that you're experiencing and gaining buy-in for a common team-related solution. So here is the summary. The first thing you do is you describe the current situation. You describe the desired outcome or what needs to change. Then you look at your forces that are driving the change to the desired outcome, or the driving forces. Oops, pressed the wrong button again. And then you identify the forces resisting change, or the restraining forces. And then, of course, you come up with some things that you can do, some strategies that can either strengthen the driving forces or weaken the restraining forces. And you do that by first evaluating the importance and the likelihood of change and deciding on which forces you can work. And that's, I think, pretty much what I wanted to say. Oh, I had one more here. Discuss the forces that could impact the change efforts the most with the least efforts, or the lowest hanging fruit. Decide how you can either weaken a restraining force or strengthen a driving force. Keep in mind, by the way, that sometimes strengthening a force just means bringing it more to your attention. So, for example, if in your problem, one of the driving forces for solving it is, I don't know, pressure from stakeholders, one of the things that you can do is bring that pressure from stakeholders more strongly to the attention of your team. Keep vigilant and flexible. Changes produce further changes, so remember the domino effect. And that's pretty much what you want to do with the force field analysis. I hope this was a useful presentation to you. Take care.